He let her think the secret was hers. For 11 weeks, Severin Lordan had watched his quietest secretary hide the thing that was slowly remaking her body, and he had said nothing, because the hour he spoke it aloud was the hour other men would hear it too. 2 days before a wedding built to swallow his empire, he stood in a cold jeweler's salon and finally let himself understand the whole of it. The child Junia Ray was hiding was the reason a rival house had already decided she would never be allowed to simply walk away. So, he did the unthinkable thing. He called off the wedding. The vault room beneath Emil's shop smelled of polish, old velvet, and money that had never once been warm. Severin stood at the heart of it while the jeweler turned his left hand beneath a hooded lamp, sliding a band of white gold to the base of his finger and clicking his tongue at the fit. Severin did not like his hands held. He had spent the early part of his life making certain no one could hold them, and the habit had set into his bones like an old break that healed crooked. But he kept still, because stillness was a language the Harrows understood, and this whole week was a message written for them to read. A man who could stand motionless while another man fitted metal to his body was a man who feared nothing. That was the lie the fitting was meant to tell, and Severin had grown expert at telling it. "Half a size larger," Emil murmured, not looking up. "The knuckle is wider than the base. It is always so with men who have broken their hands." "Leave the room in it," Severin said. "I do not intend to take it off." Emil's eyes flicked up, then down again, and he said nothing, because discretion was the only reason a jeweler like Emil stayed in business in a city like this one. He measured men who wore holsters under their coats to their own weddings, and he measured them quietly, and he asked no questions about the faint dark stain that would not quite come out of a cuff. Across the little chamber, seated in the one chair worth sitting in, Delphine Harrow did not glance up from the tablet balanced on her knee. She was beautiful the way a struck match is beautiful, brief and bright, and meant to set something alight before it burned itself out. Her dark hair was pinned so tightly it looked like it hurt. Her nails were the color of dried blood, and her thumbs moved across the glass with the flat efficiency of a woman spending other people's afternoons. "The vows run 90 seconds, no longer," she said. "My father cannot sit through more without reaching for his phone, and I will not have him reading messages while a priest is speaking. My grandmother's stone goes into your band, not mine. People need to see your hand wearing our name." "Whatever you want, Delphine," Severin said. It was the truest thing he had said all week, and the emptiest. He did not want her. She did not want him. What she wanted was the rail lines, the bonded warehouses out at Coldwater, the 300 quiet miles of track over which a country's freight moved, without ever being looked at too closely. What he had wanted, until 11 weeks ago, was her father's cash routes, the armored trucks, the private bank that could put dirty money to sleep and wake it clean the next morning. 2 families, 1 seam, stitched shut with a wedding, and 300 guests who would eat his food and drink his wine, and never once guessed that the whole evening was a corporate document with a band playing over it. They understood each other perfectly. That was supposed to be enough. For a man like Severin, who had never once been loved and had stopped expecting to be, perfect understanding had always seemed like the most a person could reasonably ask of the world. Emil carried the band behind a curtain to his bench, and for a while Severin was left holding his own bare hand up to the cold light, studying the pale groove the ring had already pressed into his skin. He looked at the door. She was not there. That was the wrongness he could not set down, the small missing weight in the room, the absence that his eye kept returning to the way a tongue returns to a broken tooth. For 4 years, Junia Ray had stood a half step behind his right shoulder in rooms exactly like this one, plain in flat shoes and a gray coat, holding the folder before he knew he wanted it, supplying the number he had lost, catching the name as it slipped past him. She had a gift for making herself the least interesting thing in any room, which was precisely what made her the most useful thing in it. Men postured for Severin. They straightened their spines for Delphine. They forgot Junia entirely, and so they spoke in front of her the way a man speaks in front of furniture, and every careless word came back to Severin by evening, folded neat and set on his desk without comment. She should have been here, in the corner, with the battered green tin of honey drops she carried everywhere, and set upon the table before any meeting that might turn ugly, as though a sweet could dull the edge of a knife. She had done it for 4 years and never once explained why. He had never asked. There were a great many things about Junior Ray he had never thought to ask. And standing in that cold, bright room, he was beginning to feel the full weight of every one of them settle onto him at once. The tin was not on the table. She was not in the corner. And the man Severin had put on the street behind her had sent him a photograph at dawn that he could not stop seeing every time he blinked. "Where is your girl?" Delphine asked, still not lifting her eyes. "The plain one." She was to bring the schedule. "She is unwell," Severin said. It was not a lie. It was only a very small piece of the truth. And he watched Delphine accept it and pass over it the way she passed over everything that carried no price to her. He did not tell her that Junia had not answered her phone since the night before. He did not tell her that a man he trusted had been quietly walking a dozen steps behind his own secretary for 9 days, or that the man's last message had arrived before the sun and said only, "Someone else is watching her too." He told Delphine nothing, because Delphine was the daughter of the man he was now almost certain had given the order, and the first rule of the life Severin had built was that you did not show your wound to the blade that made it. The car smelled of leather and rain not yet fallen. Severin sat in the back with his ruined patience while the city slid past the tinted glass towers giving way to the low gray bones of the freight district, and he let himself do the thing he had refused to do in front of Delphine. He let himself count the signs, one by one, the way a man counts the stairs in the dark. He had noticed the coffee first. For 4 years, Junia had taken it the way he did, black and scalding. 2 cups before the sun cleared the yards. Then, some 11 weeks ago, she had begun leaving it to go cold at her elbow, and then she had stopped pouring it at all, and had started keeping a thermos of something pale and gingery that she believed he did not see. He saw everything she did. That was the arrangement between them, even if she had never once known it was an arrangement. He had noticed the way she pressed the back of her wrist to her lips in the late morning and turned her face toward the window, and the way the color would drain out of her and then climb slowly back. He had noticed that the gray coat which had hung loose on her narrow frame for 4 years was now held closed by a hand she kept flat and low against herself when she believed no one was looking, not because it would no longer close, but because she had begun to guard the place beneath it without seeming to know she was doing it. He had noticed her counting on her fingers under the desk when she thought his door was shut, her lips moving over the arithmetic of weeks. And 3 weeks ago she had come to him with a question, asked in a voice so carefully level that the care itself was the tell. She had wanted to know whether the doctor who worked for the family could be trusted to keep a thing from the family. He had said yes. It was a lie. And they had both known it was a lie. And she had thanked him in her flat, quiet way and gone back to her desk and never raised it again. That question had frightened him more than any threat ever had, because a threat he knew what to do with. A threat he could answer with men and money and a quiet hour at the edge of the water. But a woman who needed a secret kept from the only world she lived in was a woman with a target already drawn around her that she could not yet see the edges of. In his world, a child was not a joy. A child was a lever long enough to move a man like him, the kind of thing rivals seized to control, or made quietly disappear to be rid of. The moment anyone learned that the lord in line had a next page written into it, that page would have a target drawn across it, and no amount of money would ever buy it back. So he had said nothing. He had smiled at her over cold coffee, and let her believe she was invisible, and he had put Marek on the street behind her, not to catch her selling him out, which is what any other boss in the city would have assumed of a secretary who had gone strange, but to stand between her and whatever was coming while she went on thinking she stood alone. It was the only protection he could give her that would not also announce, to every ear that listened, exactly what she was worth to him. For 9 days it had held. On the 10th day, the watching had changed. Marek had first noticed them as a gray sedan that idled a little too long at the mouth of the street, then as a second man who was a little too careful, then as a pattern that did not belong to anyone Severin employed. Professionals. Patient ones. The kind that cost real money and worked for men who did not like to fail. And then, before dawn this very morning, the message. Someone else is watching her too. Beneath it, a photograph Marek had taken through a rain-streaked windshield, a man in a doorway across from the entrance to Vane Street, collar up, a cigarette cupped against the wet. Severin had enlarged the image on the small screen until the picture broke into grain, and even through the grain he had known the coat, and he had known the heavy signet ring on the hand that held the cigarette, because he had shaken that hand at a Christmas table not 4 months ago. It was a Harrow man. The family Severin was 2 days from marrying into already had eyes on the mother of his child, which meant they already knew, which meant the wedding had never been a wedding at all, not for a single hour, not from the first handshake. It had been a hunt wearing a wedding's clothes, and he had walked into the center of it with his own throat bared, because he had been too busy choosing suits to look at the shadows moving at the edges of the room. "Faster," Severin said. Marek's eyes rose to meet his in the mirror, dark and steady. He had a soldier's face, all weather and no worry, and he did not waste breath asking whether they ought to be doing this. He only pressed the car forward into the thickening rain and said, "The Harrow man left the doorway an hour ago. I do not like that he left." "Neither do I," Severin said, and meant it more than Marek could know. A watcher who stayed was a watcher still gathering. A watcher who left was a watcher who had gone to fetch the others. The phone in Severin's coat had rung 4 times since the salon. Twice it was Delphine, once her father, once a number he did not recognize, and he had let all 4 of them die unanswered against his chest. He could see the whole shape of the afternoon they wanted from him, the tasting and the seating chart, and the photographer who needed the light before the storm broke. The entire glittering machine of the wedding grinding smoothly onward while a Harrow soldier stood in the rain outside a slum and waited for a plain woman to come to her window. He would not give them 1 more hour of the performance. The performance was finished. He simply had not yet told the other actors that the curtain was down. He made himself think it through the way he thought through everything, cold and in order, because the alternative was to think about her alone in that flat, with her hand pressed low against herself, and that was a door he could not open and still keep the car pointed straight. Part of him, the part he trusted least, kept offering him the easy and ugly reading of it, that she had run, that she had taken the child and gone, not because the Harrows frightened her, but because he did, because she had looked at the man she worked for, the man who signed for other men's disappearances, and had decided that no child of hers would grow up inside the reach of hands like his. That version sat in his chest like a swallowed stone, and the worst part, the part that scraped, was that he would not have blamed her for it. He would have understood it completely, and it would have destroyed him all the same. But the stone did not fit the facts, and Severin had built an entire life on trusting facts over feelings. She had not cleared her desk. She had not touched the accounts she could have emptied in a single morning and vanished on forever. She had gone to ground in the same freezing flat she had lived in for years, the one whose address he had only learned 9 days ago and had not slept properly since, and she had gone silent in exactly the way a frightened person goes silent when they are trying to press themselves so flat against the wall that the danger passes over without seeing them. She was not running from him. She was hiding from something, and she had chosen to do it without him, because she believed, after 4 years standing at his shoulder, that she was a thing he could stand to lose. That was the arithmetic that undid him. He had let her believe it. He had built the belief in her, brick by patient brick. Every single morning he took the folder from her hand and never once asked why she flinched at the mention of the family doctor, or why she had begun turning gray at the smell of the coffee she used to love. "Marek," he said, "the 9 days you walked behind her, did she ever once see you?" "No." "Good." He watched the last of the clean city die away into the low brick and broken glass of the hollows. "She is never to know it was me. Whatever happens now, she believes she has been alone. Let her keep believing it until I decide otherwise." Marek's jaw shifted, the closest he ever came to disagreement, and then he nodded, because that was the arrangement too, and because he had learned long ago that Severin's cruelties and Severin's mercies were often the same act seen from different sides. They turned onto Vane Street. It was a dead-end gut of the hollows, a single row of slumped 4-story buildings leaning on one another in the rain, like drunks who had stopped holding each other up out of affection and now did it only out of habit. The streetlights had been shot dark for privacy long ago, and the wet road shone in the gloom like something freshly skinned. Marek slowed, and Severin, already reaching for the door before the car had fully stopped, saw the two things at once that turned the chill in his chest to solid ice. The doorway across from her building stood empty, and the door to her building itself stood open, swinging a hand's width back and forth on its hinges in the wind, though there was not one living soul on the street to have opened it. He went in without waiting for Marek. The lobby of her building was a throat of cold air and old smoke, the tiled floor gritted with sand that someone had thrown down against the ice a winter ago and had never once swept away. A single bulb burned behind a wire cage on the wall, and it flung his shadow up the stairwell ahead of him, tall and warped across the peeling paint, so that he seemed to be climbing toward some larger and darker version of himself waiting at the top. He did not draw the pistol under his arm. Not yet. A drawn gun in a stairwell was a promise he was not ready to make until he knew exactly what waited above. The building breathed around him as he climbed. Behind the thin doors of the lower floors, a life was happening that had nothing to do with him and would go on having nothing to do with him. A television laughed at itself in an empty room. A kettle began to scream somewhere and was silenced. And above it all, a baby was crying, thin and steady and endless, and the sound pressed a flat hand against his sternum and would not lift it, because he could not hear it now without thinking of the small folded fact that Junia had carried up these same stairs every night, alone, while he sat in a warm, bright house across the city and pretended, even to himself, that he did not know. Everything in this place was the exact reverse of the world he had come from that morning. The salon had smelled of polish and lavender and stale wealth. This building smelled of damp plaster and boiled onions, and the sharp animal tang of a stairwell where the heat had failed, and people had simply learned to live cold, the way people learn to live with any wound that no one is coming to dress. He had paid her enough to leave this behind 3 times over. He had assumed the money did what money did. He had assumed wrong, and the assumption had a taste to it now, ashen and intimate, that he could not spit out no matter how he worked his jaw. The stairs turned back on themselves at every landing. 2nd floor, 3rd. The higher he climbed, the quieter it grew, until the crying baby was only a memory somewhere below him, and the loudest thing left in the world was the whisper of his own coat and the rain hammering on a skylight he could not see. On the third-floor landing, a window had been broken and boarded over, and cold, wet air poured through the gap around the warped plywood, carrying in the smell of the street, of rain falling on dead and forgotten things. He had grown up in a stairwell almost exactly like this one, in a building almost exactly this cold, in a corner of the city not 2 miles from where he now climbed. He had spent the whole of his adult life putting distance between himself and the smell of it, layering that distance in marble and glass and money, and it had taken him only 9 days to understand that Junia had been living inside the very thing he had run from, quietly, without complaint, folding his files in a room with no heat while he signed for imported flowers he did not want. The symmetry of it sat in him like a blade laid flat against the skin. He had climbed out of a place like this. He had let her climb down into one, and he had called it a salary. That was when he heard it, above him. Not footsteps. A single sound, small and sharp, of something being set down too hard. The particular sound a person makes when their hands are shaking, and they have run clean out of the time it takes to be gentle. He stopped with one hand on the cold rail. He had spent his whole life reading sounds in stairwells, and this one told him 2 things at once. Someone was still up there in the flat, and whoever it was had reached the end of patience and was moving now with the ragged speed of the truly afraid. He climbed the final flight slowly, setting each foot at the outer edge of the tread where old wood does not speak, and he let his hand rise at last to the lapel of his coat, to the hard, cold shape hidden beneath it. The top landing was narrow and lit by nothing but the gray leaking in through a curtainless hall window, and at the far end of it stood her door. It was ajar. A hand's width of dark showed at its edge. The frame around the lock was splintered, pale raw wood showing through the old paint like bone showing through torn skin, and the splinters were fresh, bright, unweathered by even a single day of grime. Someone had forced this door, and not long ago, and had not troubled to close it behind them, and from inside came that same small, frantic sound again. A drawer, a latch, a thing being packed in haste or a thing being searched for. He could not yet tell which. He pushed the door open with 2 fingers and stepped into the cold. The flat was 1 room and the broken promise of a second, and it was very nearly empty, and that emptiness stopped him more completely than any ambush could have. There was no life in it. That was the wrongness his eye kept catching on, the same way it had caught on the missing tin back in the salon. A person had slept here, and eaten here, and been sick here in the raw early mornings, and had left almost no mark of any of it behind. A single thin mattress lay on the floor beneath the window, made up with a tight military neatness. 1 folding chair. A wooden crate turned on its end to serve as a table, and on the crate, a lamp with no shade, burning weakly against the gloom. Along the far wall, where another woman might have built herself a life, Junia had instead built his. 3 cardboard boxes of his files, each labeled in her small square hand, a cheap laptop, and the burner phone he had given her himself, sitting dark and dead on the middle of the crate. Set down there deliberately, he thought, and then stepped back from, the way you step back from a thing you have decided you can no longer afford to carry. She had not been living here. She had been holding a position here, the way a soldier holds a position, with nothing around her that she was not fully prepared to abandon at a single moment's notice. And now, she was abandoning it. A canvas bag lay open on the mattress, half filled and no more. A coat had been pulled down from a nail in the wall. 1 drawer of the room's single battered bureau hung open and empty, and it was this drawer, he understood now, that he had heard from the stairwell, shoved shut, and then dragged open again by hands that had stopped working the way hands are meant to. But the hands were not here. The room was empty of her. His eye moved on and found the second wrongness, and everything in him went very still. There on the crate, Beside the dead phone sat the green tin, her honey drops, the one small thing she carried everywhere, the thing she set upon the table before any meeting that might turn to blood. She had left it behind. She had packed a bag to run for her life, and her child's life, and she had left behind the single object her hands reached for by pure instinct, and there were only two reasons in the world a person did a thing like that. Either she had fled in a panic so total that she had forgotten the one thing she never forgot, or she had not managed to flee at all. "Junia," he said. His voice was far too large for the room. It came back to him off the bare walls and the single rain-blind window and told him nothing. He crossed to the crate and laid the back of 2 fingers against the lamp. Warm. Lit within the hour. He touched the canvas bag on the mattress, and the coat beside it, and the coat still held the faint warmth and shape of having very recently been worn. She was close. She was minutes gone, not hours, and someone had broken down her door. There was a second door set into the wall behind him, narrow, painted the same dead institutional green as everything else in the flat, standing very slightly open on a darkness that did not move. A closet, perhaps, or the second room the flat had promised its tenants and never delivered. He had walked straight past it coming in and taken it for a stretch of blank wall. From behind it came the smallest sound he had ever heard a human being make. Not a word. A single breath, held far too long and then let go far too carefully, the breath of someone trying with everything left in them to make no shape at all against the dark. Severin took his hand away from his coat. Whatever else happened in the next moment, he did not want the first thing she saw to be a gun. "It is me," he said, to the narrow band of black. "It is only me." The door did not open, but the breathing behind it changed, quickened, and then a voice came out of the dark that was hers and yet was not hers, stripped all the way down to bare wire. "You are supposed to be at the tasting." For 4 years she had spoken to him only in complete and useful sentences, in that flat, competent voice that gave nothing away, and he had never once heard it do what it did now, which was shake. He stood rooted where he was in the freezing room and understood, with a clarity that frightened him, that if he moved too fast toward that door she would come apart entirely, and so he did the single hardest thing his body knew how to do, which was nothing at all. "I left the tasting," he said. "I find I do not much care whether the cake is lemon or almond." A sound came from behind the door that might, in some other and kinder life, have been a laugh. Then silence. And then the door moved, and she came out of the dark. He had braced himself, on the long climb up, for injury. He had braced himself for blood, because his mind knew only the shapes his particular life had taught it, and every shape it knew ended in blood eventually. What he had not braced himself for was how well she was, and how utterly terrified, and how much smaller she looked without the desk and the folder and the gray coat standing like a wall between them. She wore a thin sweater with the sleeves pushed up, and one hand lay spread low and flat across herself in the gesture he had watched her hide for 11 weeks, except that she was not hiding it now. She had stopped being able to hide it. Her dark hair was down around her face. Her cheeks were white and wet and furious with fear, and her eyes went over him once, fast and complete, the same way his own eyes went over a room he did not trust, checking his hands, his coat, the black doorway at his back. "You have to go," she said. "Severin, you have to go. They are watching the street. If they see your car down there, they will know. They will know that you—" She stopped. Her hand pressed flatter against herself. "You cannot be here. Not you. Anyone but you." "I know," he said. "You do not understand. There is a man. He has been standing in the doorway across the street. Gray coat. He wears a Harrow signet on his right hand, and he smokes a brand you can buy in only 2 shops in this whole city. and he left his post 1 hour and 20 minutes ago, which is the only reason I let myself climb these stairs." Severin heard his own voice drop into the low and level register he used when a thing had passed, the point where it could ever be undone. "I know about the man, Junia. I have had my own man on this street for the better part of 10 days, and this morning, before the sun was even up, he told me the one in the doorway belongs to Gideon Harrow." The room went utterly silent. Even the rain against the glass seemed to hold its breath. She stared at him. He watched the words reach her and rearrange the furniture of her whole face, watched her run them backward through 11 weeks of careful invisibility, through every cold cup of coffee and every turn toward the window, and every count of weeks on her fingers beneath a desk she had believed he never truly looked at. He watched her arrive at the edge of the truth and refuse it, and arrive at it again, and refuse it again, because to accept it meant unmaking everything she had believed about her own smallness. "No," she whispered. "No. You did not know. I was careful. I was so careful, no one could have." "You were careful," he agreed very gently. "You were the most careful person I have ever employed in my life. And I have watched you every single day for 4 years because the day I stop watching the people closest to me is the day one of them finally puts me in the ground. I knew the morning you stopped drinking the coffee. I knew before you yourself were certain." Her breath broke apart in her throat. One hand came up from where it guarded the child to press against her own mouth, and the other reached back and found the doorframe and gripped it white, and she looked at him with an expression he had no name for, because it was built out of far too many things at once: terror and relief, and a grief so old and so deep that it must have been waiting years and years for a reason to finally come out. This was the very thing he had spent 11 weeks refusing her. He had let her carry it alone, because to speak it aloud was to arm every enemy he had. And she had carried it alone, believing that his silence meant she did not matter, that she was, exactly as she had always understood herself to be, the least interesting and most forgettable thing in any of his rooms. "Then why?" she said, and could not finish it, and dragged in a breath, and tried again, her voice tearing on the words. "If you knew, why did you say nothing? Why did you let me?" She threw out one hand at the terrible, neat, empty room, at the half-packed bag, at the whole careful architecture of a woman quietly preparing to vanish off the face of the earth alone. "Why did you let me believe I was doing all of this by myself?" "Because the hour I said it out loud," he told her, "was the hour they would hear it too. A child of mine is not a happy accident in this world, Junia. It is the single most valuable thing I will ever make, and the single easiest thing to tear out of my hands. And the only protection I had it in my power to give you was to make absolutely certain that no one, not my uncle, not my friends, not even you, ever spoke it aloud in a place where it could be overheard." He took one step toward her, only one, and stopped. "So I put a man behind you to keep you breathing, and I let you go on hating my silence, because I would far rather you hate me and live than trust me and be used against me. That is the only kind of love my world has ever let me give to anyone. I am sorry that from where you were standing it looked so exactly like being left alone." She did not move for a while, and then her legs simply stopped agreeing to hold her weight, and Severin crossed the last of the freezing floor in 2 strides and caught her before she reached it. She let him hold her weight for the length of a single breath, and then she took it back from him. He felt her do it, felt the spine straighten under his hands, felt the competent secretary reassembling herself out of the pieces of the frightened woman, and he let her go because he understood that standing on her own 2 feet was the last scrap of dignity this room had left to offer her, and he would not be the one to take it. "Then you need to see what I found," she said, because knowing there is a man in a doorway is not the same thing at all as knowing what he was sent here to do. She crossed to the crate, Neil with one hand braced against it, and drew out from beneath it a flat folder he had not seen, taped to the underside of the wood where no careless search would ever find it. Her hands had gone steady again. This was the one version of herself she fully trusted, the version that handled paper, that turned chaos into columns and columns into certainty. 11 weeks ago, I asked you whether the doctor could be trusted, she said. You lied to me. I let you, because I already knew the answer was no. I had seen the doctor's name on a payment that did not come from any of your accounts. She opened the folder across her knees. It came out of a shell company the Harrows used to move money they would rather no one could trace. Your doctor has been sitting on Gideon Harrow's payroll for a year. The morning after I went to see him, the morning I finally knew for certain what I was carrying, he made a telephone call. I have the record of that call. He called Farron Kroll. Severin did not move. The names sat in the cold air between them like a live coal. Your second, she said quietly. Your oldest friend. The doctor told Kroll what I was carrying before I had breathed a word of it to another living soul, and Kroll turned around and sold it to Gideon Harrow that same afternoon, for a number I can show you on this page, and that is the day the watching began. She lifted her eyes to his, and there was no triumph anywhere in them, only a bottomless exhaustion. The wedding was never a merger, Severin. Gideon has no intention of marrying his daughter into your lines. He wants your signature on everything you own, freely given, and now at last he has found the one lever in the world strong enough to make you sign it without a fight. The child, Severin said. They mean to take me tonight. During the rehearsal. Quiet. No noise. No bodies to explain. By morning, you receive a message telling you where I am and precisely what it will cost you to see me alive again. And the cost is your name at the bottom of his papers. You hand him the rail lines and the warehouses and every quiet mile of track the marriage was only ever meant to borrow, and you do it smiling for the cameras because they will be holding both of us. Her hand pressed low against herself once more. That is why the man abandoned the doorway an hour ago. He has not gone home. He has gone to bring the others. It has already begun. Severin looked at the taped folder and the dead phone and the pitiful half-packed bag, and he understood at last the true shape of what she had been doing up here in the cold. She had not been running to save her own skin. She had uncovered the entire plan, root and branch, and she had chosen to disappear alone rather than bring it to him, because bringing it to him meant standing in front of him with the child between them and asking, out loud, to be believed. Why not come to me? He said, though he already knew the answer, and dreaded hearing her say it. Because you wanted this wedding, she said simply. For 4 years I have watched you want it, and I thought, if I bring this man a folder that says the marriage is a trap, 2 days before he signs it, he will not see the folder at all. He will only see a woman who does not want him to marry someone else. Her mouth twisted, bitter and tired. I did not trust you to believe me over the thing you wanted. So I decided to become the thing that simply vanished, and let you have your merger, and take the child somewhere your world could never once reach out and touch it. The rain filled up the silence between them, and then, from the street far below, a car door closed. They both heard it. Her eyes flew to the window and his went to his coat, and neither of them spoke while a second door closed below, and then a third, and the particular heavy quiet of armed men arriving settled over the street like a held breath. How many did the folder say? Severin asked. 4 to take me, more on the road to watch it. Then we have 2 minutes, perhaps less. He drew the phone from his coat, the real one now, and did not dial it. Instead, he sent 3 words to Marek waiting in the car below, and 3 more to a number that reached all the way out to the rail yards at Coldwater, and he watched Unia watch him do it, and watched her understand that she was no longer the only one in this room holding a plan. Then the phone rang in his hand before he could put it away, and the name that lit the screen was Gideon Harrow. He looked at it through one ring. Then he answered and held it out between them so that she could hear every word and said nothing at all. Severin. The old man's voice came through warm as a banked fire, the voice of a man who believed the game was already won and was telephoning only to enjoy the winning of it. You missed the tasting. Delphine is beside herself. I told her, a man gets cold feet before a wedding, it means nothing at all. And the only thing that matters is that he arrives at the church. A pause, thick and rich with its own pleasure. You will arrive at the church, Severin, won't you? No, Severin said. The single flat word changed the whole temperature of the call. He could hear Gideon recalibrate on the other end, hear the fire behind the voice shift from warmth to something with teeth in it. I would think very carefully, Gideon said slowly, about exactly what you have to lose this particular week. I have thought about it. I have thought about very little else for 2 days. Severin kept his eyes locked on Junia's white face. You bought a doctor, and you bought a friend, and between them you learned a thing about me that I had not yet said aloud even in my own house, and then you built a whole beautiful wedding around it. I want you to know that I found that clever, truly. And now I want you to understand the one part of it you managed to get wrong. Enlighten me, then. You believed the child was a lever you could pull whenever you liked. You believed I would sign the entire world away to protect it. And in that you were exactly correct. That is precisely what I would do, without hesitation, tonight, or any night. Severin let the pause stretch until it began to hurt them both. Your only error was in arithmetic, Gideon. You assumed I would not know you were coming until it was far too late to do anything at all but pay your price, and it is already far too late. Only not for me. Down in the street below them, something changed. A shout cut off short, the flat, percussive cough of a car engine that would not turn over, because someone had quietly made certain that it never would. Gideon heard it too, bleeding through the phone from his own men on the ground, and for the first time in the call, the old, smooth voice lost the shape of its confidence. What have you done? I have called off a wedding, Severin said. The rail line's close to you at midnight tonight. Your trucks never cross my yards again, and the men you sent to collect a plain woman from a dead-end street in the Hollows are about to learn that she has not been alone for a single hour of the last 10 days, and neither have you. He was already moving toward Junia, already gathering up the canvas bag, the folder, the coat from the mattress. You reached for the one thing on this earth I would burn the whole city down to keep. So now I am going to let it burn. Do not call this number again. The next time you hear my voice, it will not be coming out of a telephone. He ended the call and crushed nothing and broke nothing, only slid the phone back into his coat, because theater had always been Gideon's habit and never once been his. Then he settled the coat around her shoulders, and he picked the green tin up off the crate without a word and pressed it firmly into her 2 hands. You forgot this, he said. You never forget this. She looked down at the battered green tin cupped in her palms as though she had never in her life seen it before. And something in her face, some last held thing, quietly came undone. We have to go down now, he said, and the stairs will not be empty. Stay close behind me, do exactly as I say, and for once in 4 years, Junia, do not try to carry any part of it by yourself. The stairs were not empty. Severin went down first, and Junia came close behind him with one hand knotted into the back of his coat and the tin buttoned into her pocket. And they had descended only a single flight when a shape rose up against the boarded window on the 3rd-floor landing, and a low voice said, She comes with us and nobody has to get. And never finished the sentence, because Marek came up out of the dark at the man's back in the very same instant, silent as changing weather. And the sentence ended in a manner that was swift and certain and final, and that Severin turned Junia's face away from with one flat hand so that she would not have to see it. 2 more were in the lobby, Merrick said, stepping over what lay on the landing. Handled. The road is the worst problem. They have the mouth of the street corked. Then we do not take the street. Severin was already moving her down and around the turn. The freight door at the back. The building backs onto the old dead spur line. They went down and through a black corridor that stank of coal dust and standing water, and out through a steel door that shrieked on its rusted hinges into a rain-black cut where a long dead rail spur ran between 2 brick walls, and there, idling with its lights killed, waited a second car and 2 more of his men come in from the yards, and Junia was folded into the back of it with a blanket around her shoulders, and Severin beside her, before she had entirely understood that the worst of the night was already behind them. She was silent against him for the whole of the drive, and he did not try to fill the silence, because he had learned long ago that there are kinds of quiet a person needs to be left alone inside. Her hand had found the edge of his coat somewhere in the dark and closed on it, not gripping, only holding, the way a child holds a sleeve in a crowd, and he kept himself very still so that she would not have to think about the holding, or decide what it meant, or take it back. Outside the glass, the hollows gave way to better streets, and the better streets gave way to the wide black quiet of the district where men like him bought their peace by the acre, and with every mile she seemed to settle a little heavier against his side, as though the distance itself were a weight being lifted off her 1 yard at a time. It was only when the iron gates of Alder Court swung shut behind the car that she finally began to shake, and it was the delayed and violent shaking of a body that has held itself rigid for 11 weeks, and has at last, without permission, been given leave to stop. The great house was warm and enormous and smelled of beeswax and cut lilies, and she hated it on sight. He could see plainly that she hated it, the sheer insulated cleanliness of it after the raw cold of the flat. And he found, to his own surprise, that he loved her a little more for hating it. He took her not to a guest room, but to the warm study where the fire was already lit, and he wrapped her in far more than she needed, and he sent out for a doctor who was not the one who had betrayed him, a woman named Merrigan, who had been setting the broken bones of his men for years and had never once in all that time exchanged a single word with a harrow. While Dr. Merrigan examined her behind the shut study door, Severin stood alone in the hall and made himself do the thing he had refused to do all day. He made himself think about the year, a whole year. The doctor had been Gideon's creature for a year, which meant that Kroll had almost certainly been Gideon's creature for at least as long, which meant that for one entire turning of the seasons, his oldest living friend had sat across tables from him and poured his wine and laughed at his jokes and carried the private shape of his life back to the very man now working to take it all away. And into the middle of that year, into that quiet, warm nest of betrayal, a frightened woman had walked, carrying the single most dangerous secret Severin owned, and she had chosen to swallow it whole and alone rather than hand it to a house she could no longer read the loyalties of. She had been entirely right not to trust the house. She had simply been wrong, heartbreakingly wrong, about which part of it would fail her. It should have been him. In any accounting she could have made of the men around her, he was the one with the most to gain from silencing her. The boss whose wedding she threatened. The cold man who signed for disappearances. That she had reasoned her way to fearing everyone except the one person who had quietly put a guard at her back was not a failure of her mind, which was the finest he had ever worked beside. It was a failure of his, 4 years in the making. Every morning he had taken the folder and given nothing back across the desk but a nod. The study door opened. Dr. Merrigan came out drying her hands on a cloth and looked at him with the flat, unsparing honesty he paid her so well to keep. "She is well," the doctor said. They are both of them well. But she is worn down to the last thread, Severin. She has been running on fear and cold and far too little food for weeks now, and that cannot go on. She needs warmth and rest, and above everything she needs to stop being afraid. The doctor paused with one hand on the door. Whatever it is that is frightening her this badly, it needs to be gone, and soon. It will be, Severin said. Tonight. And down the hall, in a room he did not yet know to search, a phone that belonged to Farron Kroll buzzed once against a hard tabletop, lighting with a message from Gideon Harrow that read only, "The yards, before midnight. Bring every man you have." He went back into the study and found her standing at the fire, wrapped in the blanket, holding the green tin against her chest, and she turned when he entered with the old sharp light already come back up in her eyes. "You cannot go to war on the strength of what I babbled at you in a panic," she said. "You need it laid out flat. All of it, every page. Or you will walk into those yards half blind and they will cut your men down in the dark." She set the tin down carefully on the mantel. "Bring me the laptop. Not in the morning. Now." The doctor said rest. The doctor did not read the folder. She held his gaze without flinching. "You told me not to carry it alone anymore. Very well, then let me set it down properly in front of you, so that you are carrying it too, because at this moment I am the only person inside this entire house who holds the whole map in her head, and if something should happen to me between now and midnight, it dies right along with me." Her jaw set hard. "That is the arithmetic of it, Severin. Sit down." He sat down. For the next hour, or near enough to it, she was the woman he had spent 4 years failing to properly see. The fever of her fear burned off and left behind only the cold, clean machinery of her mind, and she walked him through the folder one page at a time, and it was worse, far worse, than she had been able to tell him up in the flat. Kroll had not merely sold the secret of the child, Kroll had sold the map. He had handed Gideon the guard rotations at the Coldwater Yards, the blind corners along the fence line, the exact night on which the bonded warehouse ran with its thinnest crew. The rehearsal night snatch had only ever been the soft plan, the clean and quiet one. If the soft plan should fail, and Severin had just personally made certain that it would, the folder held a second plan, a hard one, and the hard one was the yards. "They will strike Coldwater tonight," she said. "Not to take me any longer. That window has closed. They will strike it to wound you, to seize the stock inside the bonded warehouse and burn whatever they cannot carry, so that even if you refuse to sign a single line, you end this week smaller and poorer than you began it." Kroll handed them everything they need to do exactly that. He is the reason it works at all. She brought up a final page on the screen. And here is the when of it. The warehouse guard changes at 11:30. There is a gap of 9 minutes while the outgoing night crew walks the perimeter before the fresh crew takes the posts. That 9-minute gap is what Kroll sold them. That is the window they come through. She turned the laptop a few degrees so that the screen faced him square. "And there is one thing more, and it is the thing that tells me he meant to survive tonight and stand at your funeral wearing black. Look at the last name on the perimeter list." Kroll wrote himself in as the man walking the south fence during the gap. He gave himself the one post that is nowhere near the warehouse when the shooting starts. He was not planning to fight your men in the dark, Severin. He was planning to be 100 yards away with clean hands, ready to be the loyal friend who arrived too late to save you. Severin looked at the heavy clock on the mantel. It was a little after 10. "How long have you known it would come down to the yards?" he asked her quietly. "Since the doctor's payment. Since the very first day." She looked down at her own folded hands. "I have known for 11 weeks that this thing ended in blood somewhere, and I could not decide whether telling you would save your life or spend it. And every single day that I failed to decide, the child grew a little bigger, and the choice grew a little heavier, and I grew a little smaller underneath the weight of it. And that in the end is the whole shameful truth of why you found me in that terrible room stuffing a bag. Not because I was brave, because I could not make the choice, so I ran from ever having to make it." He crossed to her, and he did not touch her, only stood close enough that she was forced to tip her head back to look at him. "You chose tonight," he said. "You chose in the only moment that ever counted for anything. That is the only kind of choosing there has ever been." He glanced once at the clock. 11:30, a gap of 9 minutes. It is enough, and it is enough for one reason only. They believe Kroll's map is still good. And Kroll does not yet know that the woman who was meant to be terrified and alone in the dark tonight is instead sitting in my study, warm, having just handed me every single move they intend to make before they make it. He went to the door and called for Marek, and for the men, and when he turned back to her, she had taken up the tin again and was holding it against her ribs like a thing that kept her heart fastened in its place. "Stay in this room," he said. "The door locks from the inside. I am leaving 2 men posted in the hall. Whatever you may hear out there, you do not open this door for anyone whose voice you do not know better than your own. Severin." She stopped him at the threshold. Her voice had gone thin as paper. "Do not make this child grow up hearing stories about how brave its father was. Come back and be ordinary and dull and alive instead." Something crossed his face then that had never in his whole life been permitted there before. "I have every intention," he said, "of being extraordinarily dull for the rest of my days." The Coldwater Yards lay beneath a sky the color of wet iron, a vast dark field of standing freight cars and dead rusted track, and the long, low bulk of the bonded warehouse squatting at the heart of it. And the rain had thinned now to a cold, needling mist that hung suspended in the sodium light and turned every ordinary shadow into the shape of a waiting man. Severin came in off the dead spur line on foot, the way the trains themselves came, silent along the crunching ballast, with Marek at his shoulder and 8 of his own people fanning out wide into the dark behind him. He did not approach from the front. Kroll's map had told the Harrows exactly where his men would be thin. What the map had not told them, what it could not have told them, was that Severin now held the map himself, and so he had done the one single thing the map could never survive. He had moved his people to stand in precisely the places the map swore blind would be empty. He felt nothing as he walked the ballast. That was the part of himself he had never been able to explain to anyone, the cold, flat stillness that came down over him when the talking was finished and only the doing remained. Other men described rage, or fear, or a racing heart. Severin felt the world go quiet and very clear. Every edge of it sharpened, every sound arriving at him one at a time and named. It was the thing that had kept him alive out of the hollows. It was also, he suspected, the exact thing Junia had seen in him across 4 years and quietly decided to guard against, setting her small tin down on tables so that the stillness would have its 3 seconds to move. At 28 minutes past 11, the Harrow trucks rolled in dark and low through the north gate, 3 of them riding heavy on their suspensions the way a truck rides when it has come to be filled, and the men who dropped down out of them moved with the loose, easy confidence of a crew that has already bought the guard rotation and believes to its bones that the next 9 minutes belong to them alone. They went toward the warehouse fast and quiet, and among them, at the very center of them, unhurried, a radio held loose in one hand, and the good wool coat Severin had bought him 2 winters ago hanging from his shoulders, walked Farron Kroll. Severin watched his oldest friend walk his enemies in through the door of his own house, and felt the very last warm thing left inside his chest quietly gutter out and go cold. He let them reach the loading door. He let Kroll lift the radio to his mouth to report that the gap had opened. And then Marek cut the yard lights. The sodium towers died all at once, every one of them, and the darkness that dropped down over the yard was total and instant, and into that darkness Severin's people moved, men and women who had counted the exact number of steps to their marks while the lights still burned and had no need of them now. While the Harrow crew froze where they stood in a blackness their expensive map had never thought to prepare them for. What followed was short, and it was terrible, and it was entirely one-sided, and Severin moved through the thick of it without any hurry at all, and it was decisive. And it was finished in less time than the 9 minutes Kroll had sold, and when the lights shuttered back up, the yard belonged to Severin, and the 3 trucks belonged to no one, and Ferran Kroll was on his knees on the wet concrete with his good coat ruined and his hands hanging empty at his sides, and Severin standing over him. Severin! Kroll's voice cracked apart on the name. They made me do it. Gideon has my sister. He swore to me that he would. You do not have a sister, Severin said. You have a boat you cannot afford and a debt you hid from me for a year and a price that Gideon Harrow was willing to meet. He crouched down, slowly, so that the 2 of them were level, so that the last thing left standing between them was nothing but the truth. I would have covered the debt. You know that I would have. You have known me 20 years. All you ever had to do was come to me and say, Severin, I am drowning, and I would have thrown you the whole of the boat and never once mentioned it again. Instead, you sold him a woman who trusted you, and the child she had not yet even named. A secretary, Kroll spat, and the fear in him curdled all at once into something far uglier. All of this whole war, for a secretary and a mistake she made with you. Severin regarded him without expression for a while. She is not a secretary, he said at last. She is the only person in 20 years who chose the harder loyalty over the easy one. She swallowed the single thing that could have owned me whole, and she nearly died of it up there in the cold, because she decided that protecting me was worth more than being believed by me. You have never once in your entire life understood a loyalty shaped like that. And that, precisely that, is why you were able to sell it for the price of a boat. He rose back up to his full height. You will not stand in these yards again. You will not be seen in this city again. Merrick is going to explain the arrangement to you, and you are going to be grateful for every word of it, because it is a great deal more than the man you have made of yourself deserves, and it is exactly what the man I remember once earned. He turned his back on his oldest friend, which was at once the only mercy and the only sentence he had left in him to give, and he walked away toward the spur line and the waiting car and the long road home. And in his coat pocket the phone buzzed once, a message from the house, from one of the 2 men he had posted in the hall, and it read, She will not lie down. She is at the window watching the road for you. And Severin found himself standing there amid the ruin of the yard with his friend on his knees behind him, almost beginning to smile. The drive back out to Alder Court was the longest quarter of an hour of the night. Now that the doing was finished, the cold clarity drained out of him and left the ordinary man standing underneath it. And the ordinary man was afraid, in a way the boss never once permitted himself to be, of walking into that study and finding the chair by the fire gone cold and empty. He had left her guarded. He had left 2 good men in the hall, and the door bolted from the inside. It made no difference at all to the fear. He understood, watching the wet road unspool in the headlights, that he had just handed a hostage to the whole world without ever meaning to, that from this night onward there would always be a room somewhere with the entirety of his heart sitting quietly inside it, and that no number of men in any hallway would ever let him feel wholly safe again. He found, to his own surprise, that he did not want to be safe. He wanted to be hers, which was a far more dangerous thing and a far better one. She was at the window when the gate swung open. He saw her silhouette drop away from the glass the very instant the headlights swept across it, saw the light in the study go still and steady, and by the time he came through the door she had already unbolted it and was standing at the center of the room with the tin held in both hands and a question written across her face that she could not quite bring herself to ask aloud. He answered it before she had to. "It is done," he said. "Gideon has lost his men, and his map, and the friend he bought a place for inside my house, and by morning he will have lost the rail lines and the bank runs that only ever stayed clean, because I permitted them to cross my yards. He reached for something that was mine. He is going home tonight with a great deal less than nothing." He pushed the door shut behind him. "You are safe. Both of you are safe. It is over." She did not move. She stood there very still, and he watched her try with everything she had to believe it, and fail, the way a person who has braced against a blow for 11 straight weeks cannot simply unbrace on command. "Say it again," she whispered. "It is over. You do not have to disappear. You do not have to choose between me and the child. You do not have to be the smallest and quietest thing in any room ever again for the rest of your life." He crossed the floor to her. "You can set it down now, Junia. The whole of it. I am here to carry it, and I am not going anywhere at all, and there is no version of the years ahead of me that I will allow to exist without the two of you standing inside it." Her face crumpled, and this time she did not reassemble it. 11 weeks of held breath went out of her all at once, and he caught her against him, and she pressed her wet face into his shoulder and shook. And he stood there in the warm, bright room he knew she hated, and held the woman who had swallowed his most dangerous secret to keep him alive, and let her come apart against him in the absolute certainty that he would be standing there to gather up every piece. He had held men while they died. He had never once held anyone at all while they lived. He had not known, until this exact moment, with her weight against his chest and her tears soaking cold through his ruined shirt, that the second thing was by far the harder of the two, and that he had spent the better part of 40 years quietly arranging his life so that he would never have to learn the trick of it. He learned it now. He learned it standing up, on his feet, in a warm room that smelled of lilies, with a war still cooling in his hands. When she could speak again, she pulled back, only far enough to look up into his face, and the old sharpness was there behind the tears, because it had never truly left her, because it was the very material she was built out of. "You have to understand something," she said. "I need to say it now, before you go deciding what the two of us are to each other. Because if I do not say it out loud tonight, I will spend the rest of my life managing you carefully around it, and neither one of us will ever be honest again." She pulled in a breath. "All day long I have been told that this child is a lever and a target, and the most valuable thing you will ever make. And I need to know that when the danger is finally gone, when there is no war left to win and no empire left to protect, you will still want me, the plain woman with the folder, not the mother of your heir. Me. Because I have been useful to you for 4 years, Severin, and useful is not the same thing as loved, not by a long mile. And I have built an entire life out of confusing the one for the other, and I cannot go on doing it now, not with a child standing there watching us do it." He was quiet for a while. Then he reached past her to the mantel and took up the green tin and turned it slowly over in his scarred hands. "Do you know when I knew?" he said. "Not the pregnancy. You. Do you know the moment I knew about you?" He worked the lid off the tin. It was very nearly empty, only 3 honey drops left rolling loose in the bottom of it. 3 years ago, a meeting out at the yards that went bad, men with guns, and a steel table between us and them, and I was as certain as I have ever been of anything that it was about to end in the worst way. And then, without one word, You reached down into your bag and set this tin out on the table. And I remember thinking, she has lost her mind, we are 2 seconds from dying, and she is offering the room a sweet. And then I understood what you had done. He fitted the lid back on. You set it down so that every man in that room would look at the tin, and not at my hands, which were already moving toward the thing beneath the table. You bought me 3 seconds, and you have gone on buying me 3 seconds on every dangerous day since, quietly, and I have taken them from you without a word, and I never once said thank you, because I was afraid that if I said it out loud, I would have to admit to myself how completely I had come to need the plainest person in the room. He put the tin into her hand and folded her fingers closed around it. I wanted you long before there was ever a child to give me an excuse for it. The child is not the reason. The child is only the thing that finally shamed me out of being a coward about the truth. He was quiet a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower still. You asked whether I would still want the plain woman with the folder once the danger was gone. Junia, the danger has been my whole life. There has never once been a day without it. And there was never once a day, in 4 years, that I did not look for you first when I walked into a room and feel the floor go steady under me when I found you. That is not gratitude. Gratitude fades when the debt is paid. This has only ever grown. She looked down at the tin closed inside her hand, and then up at him, and for the first time in that whole long and terrible day, Junia Ray smiled. You notice the honey drops? She said. I notice everything you do, he said. It is the only reason I am still alive. The morning came in clean and cold and utterly ordinary, which was, he decided, standing at the window with a cup going cold in his hand, the single finest thing a morning had ever managed to be. Severin stood at the tall window of a room she did not hate, because sometime deep in the night he had carried her to the one warm plain corner of the whole great house, the old kitchen with its stone hearth and its long scarred table. The only room in all of Alder Court that had ever once felt like a place where an actual person might live. She was asleep at last, truly and deeply asleep, curled in a chair drawn up by the fire with her feet tucked beneath her and a blanket pulled to her chin, and on the table beside her sat the green tin, refilled to the brim, because the very first thing Severin had done at dawn was send Marek out to find the only 2 shops in the city that sold the sweets she liked and buy every last tin the both of them had on their shelves. He had watched her sleep for close to an hour before the light came up, and it had unsettled him in a way that violence never had. He knew how to guard things that fought back, things that could be counted and locked and posted with armed men. He did not yet know the first thing about guarding something that only breathed slowly by a fire and trusted him, without asking for any proof, to still be standing there when it opened its eyes. He suspected he would spend the rest of his life learning the trick of that too, and the suspicion suited him better than anything ever had. His phone had rung once, at 7. Gideon Harrow, according to the gate log at Alder Court's own wall, had already begun the long and expensive business of pretending that none of it had ever happened, and Delphine, he had since learned, had flown out before sunrise to some family holding down in the south, unmarried and unbothered and, he strongly suspected, quietly and enormously relieved to be free of the whole arrangement. The rail lines were closed. The bank runs were already rerouted. The war had lasted a single night, one night only, because the woman asleep in the chair by his fire had spent 11 silent weeks building, alone and in the cold, and believing herself invisible the entire time, the very map that ended it. She stirred. Her eyes opened, found him standing at the window, and did not startle. And that small failure to startle was its own quiet miracle, the sign of a body that had finally, after weeks, relearned that it was safe. You are looming, she said, her voice thick and slow with sleep. I am guarding. There is nothing left in the world to guard against. Old habit. He came across and crouched down beside the chair. I have been thinking about your desk. Her eyes narrowed, awake all at once. You are not firing me 2 days after I saved your entire operation single-handed. No. He almost laughed aloud. I am retiring the desk. That desk sat outside my door for 4 years so that you could be kept near enough to be useful to me and far enough to be forgotten by everyone else. And I have decided that I am finished, tonight, with both halves of that arrangement forever. He took her free hand, the one not curled around the tin. There is no version of what comes next in which you go back to being the quietest thing in my rooms. You are going to be the loudest reason I am still standing in them. That is not a promotion, Junia. It is a correction. I had it wrong for 4 years, and I intend to spend every day I have left setting it right. She looked at him for a while, and then she did the one thing that told him more than any answer she could ever have spoken. She reached over to the table, worked the lid off the green tin, took out a single honey drop, and pressed it firmly into the palm of his hand. For the next dangerous day, she said, there are no more dangerous days. There is a child coming, Severin. She smiled and closed his fingers around the sweet exactly the way that he had closed hers around the tin the night before. There will be nothing ahead of us now but dangerous days. You are going to need every last one of the 3 seconds you can get. He laughed then, fully and freely, a sound the great cold house had very likely never once heard inside its walls, and outside the tall windows the ordinary morning went on being ordinary, which was, in the end, the single most extraordinary thing that either of them had ever truly wanted out of a life. She had spent 4 years making herself invisible in order to keep him alive. She was going to spend the rest of them being the one thing in the world he could never once bring himself to look away from. And the secret she had carried up those cold and broken stairs alone, certain to the last that it would cost her absolutely everything she had, turned out in the end to be the only thing that had ever set her free. If a quiet secretary keeping a dangerous man alive with nothing but her wits and a battered tin of honey drops is the kind of slow-burn devotion you came here looking for, then do not leave without telling me the one moment tonight that got you. Was it the doorway he already knew about? The honey tin set down on the table 3 years ago? Or the very last 3 seconds she will ever have to buy him? Tell me down in the comments. Tap that like button and subscribe, because the next story is already waking up in the dark. And believe me, you are going to want to be in the room when it opens its eyes.